Jesus had been, died, come back again, and then he'd gone again, but not before he'd clued in his disciples on their mission, which was to spread the good news all across the globe. But this is not a tale about any of those guys. Since the channel began, we've slowly made our way through church history, starting off with the appropriately named Apostolic Age, following the exploits of the people that we hear about in the New Testament, people such as Peter, Paul, and John. John passed away in around 100 CE, and with his passing, we enter a new age in the church's story, the Ante-Nicene Period, which would not end until the famous council of the same name in 325 CE. In this series, we'll be looking at the people and documents who took the baton from the apostles and carried on the journey. But before we meet up with them, let's do a quick recap so we know what sort of church these guys had inherited. Originally, the church were not known as Christians, they called themselves the Followers of the Way, which is a much cooler name if you ask me. And both the actions of Jesus and the apostles drew the ire of local religious leaders and government officials. Because they were preaching some controversial stuff, people set out to silence them, which eventually ended in the ultimate way to keep someone quiet, killing them off. This tactic wasn't quite as effective as their enemies had hoped, as instead of stopping them preaching, they just carried on about this Jesus guy in all the places that they'd been forced to flee to. This got worse when a young zealous Pharisee named Saul converted to the way. There's no need to tell you about him at this point, because I've got a whole series of videos about what happened next. But needless to say, Paul and the original disciples of Jesus would not keep quiet, and their efforts created small Christian community dotted all across the Roman Empire and beyond. Many would be convinced by these followers of the way, who would soon become known as Christians, a nickname they picked up early on in Antioch, and they would happily take it on for themselves. A lot of their converts were from the lower end of society, and there was no economic barrier to entry. The preachers also would specifically seek out the poorer members of society and help them out, because it was part of their faith. With the examples of Paul and Peter, these new converts didn't really have to adhere to a ton of new rules, and slowly, Christianity began to drift away from its Jewish roots. It was not, however, plain sailing for the new faith on the block. It was often misunderstood and viewed with suspicion, as the way that they did things was markedly different from some of the other religions around. They were accused of cannibalism because of the language of the Eucharist, and they were labelled as atheists because they claimed that the many gods of the time were false. And worse still, they claimed that the emperor was not the son of a god, but their founder was. They were weird and different. As a strange little different religion, they often had persecution come their way. Nero, of course, famously blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, and no doubt many had to flee during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Most of the apostles died in a violent manner, which we learned about in my last series. There were, of course, internal struggles as well. Paul's letters to the Galatians is particularly scathing, and there were factions forming in some of the churches around their favourite apostles. Early on, the question of whether non-Jewish converts should follow Jewish laws was a hot topic of debate. So, by the year 100 CE, Christianity had gone through a lot of stuff. At this point, everything in the New Testament had been written. They'd been on the receiving end of an emperor's scapegoating, and they were still regarded by lots with suspicion. The first bricks had of course been laid in the church that we know of today, but the foundation, well, it wasn't quite complete yet. You see, there were questions arising that needed to be sorted out. Why hasn't Jesus come back yet? What does the Son of God actually mean? Which of all these letters and documents that we've got floating around are legitimate scripture? And why is that? Of course, the early church had its share of drama going on as well, so corrective action and advice had to be given out. So these Christians were now trying to figure out what Christianity should look like, a process that's, well, still going on today. There was no official version of the faith, there were no creeds or rule books, so a lot of ideas were being thrown out there. And this is where the Apostolic Fathers enter the scene. As these guys had been tutored by the original 12, they sought to guide the flock, and thankfully, we have some of their letters to see what direction they were trying to take them in, as well as giving us a snapshot of what was actually going on in that first century church, now that all the apostles had gone. The first of the Apostolic Fathers I'm going to cover is not actually a person, but it's a document, the earliest example of a set of rules and guidance that the church was using. The document was called the Didache, or Teaching, or if you want the full title, the Lord's Teaching through the 12 Apostles to the Nations. So if you want to know what happened after all the Bible stuff, then stick around. Maybe even subscribe for some more theology or beer-related content. So until next time, go grab yourself a drink and ask some questions, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.